episode of the Animal Riot Podcast, brought to you by Animal Riot Press, a literary press for books that matter. I'm Katie Rainey, filling in for Brian Birnbaum while he's taking some time off, and I'm very happy to welcome writer and director of the Noepe Center for Literary Arts up in Martha's Vineyard, Mathea Moret, to the show. Hey, welcome, Mathea.
Thank you.
Mathea Moret was raised in St. Louis, Missouri. She has a degree in literature from NYU and worked in music journalism for many years, which I want to talk about. That's fairly interesting. How you went from one to the other.
Yeah.
Her work has appeared in The New Engagement, Slush Pile Magazine, Arts and Ideas, and Anti-Heroin Chic. She's the director of the Noepe Center for Literary Arts on Martha's Vineyard and has taught creative writing to children and young adults for over 15 years. She lives with her husband and her 3 daughters and a beloved dog. What's the dog's name?
Cassius.
Okay. Mathea just met my beast who's staring at us.
Oh, no, she's
through the window.
Sleeping
She's
peacefully.
She went to the vet today, so she's not happy. And you just read for Dead Rabbits last night.
I did.
Exciting.
It was really fun.
Yes, your book just came out in October, right?
It did. Yeah, it's like its almost 4-month birthday, a couple of days, I think. Yeah.
Have you been doing a book tour or anything?
Not officially. I've done a few readings on Martha's Vineyard, and I read in Boston, and I went back to St. Louis and did kind of a St. Louis book launch in December. And then just coming to you guys. It's really been sort of low-key, which has been nice. I'm not necessarily a big traveler, so the idea of going all around the country and staying in hotels was not high on my list. And
Yeah, Martha's Vineyard's hard enough to get off and on.
hard. It's a lot
You got to
of
take a
work.
ferry.
Yep, includes a lot of different modes of transportation.
Well, let's talk about your background first and how you came. When did you start writing?
I don't know. I think I was like 15 or 16 the first time I wrote like an actual story that I was like, oh, this is a story. But, you know, writing off and on since then, I did a lot of journalism coming out of college and all the way up. And I think I started really writing fiction seriously after I had my first kid, which was 20 years ago now. It's crazy. And it took a long time because I didn't, you know, because I had kids pretty young. I really wasn't in a place to sort of go that MFA route, and so I really had to be kind of self-taught, which meant a lot of writing really bad stuff for a really long time.
I think that's true whether you're in an MFA or not.
Fair, right? I just was. It took me a little bit longer, and I had to, you know. I didn't have to pay for it, so I guess that's good. Yeah.
yeah, without that debt. Yeah.
Yep. And I started working on this book actually right after Michael Brown was murdered in St. Louis. I was, you know, far away. It had been many years since I had lived there, but I had wanted to write about what it was like growing up there pretty much ever since I left and realized that my life experience wasn't like everybody else's, you know, or I think I just assumed that everybody else grew up the way I did, you know. And once I left and came up to the Northeast and New York and New England and realized how very different it was, but then at the same time realized the perception that people in New York and New England have about what it's like in the Midwest or the South, because St. Louis is kind of one of those places that's sort of both. It's
I'm from Little Rock originally.
So right, I think we talked about that.
Yeah.
So there's this concept, like this preconceived notion of what it's like outside, anywhere outside of New England or the Northeast, and it's wrong. So when Michael Brown was murdered, I think like a lot of people felt I was far away. I wasn't living there anymore, but I wanted to somehow contribute. I wanted to, not feel hopeless.
Yeah.
And I thought about what it was that I personally had to add to the conversation. And I felt like that was it, that I was far away, you know, that I was from there and I was far away, and what it felt like to sort of look back around this event to what it meant to grow up there in the 90s and the 80s and 90s.
I'm curious because I feel like maybe St. Louis probably has a better number of authors coming out of it than Little Rock. There's like literally 2 that I could probably name. Okay, we got Charles Portis, and that's about it in Little Rock. Are there any other authors from St. Louis that you, I don't know, were inspired by or come to mind just thinking of that portrait you're painting?
No. I mean, there are definitely writers that have come out of there, but like Jonathan Franzen has written about St. Louis.
Oh, really?
I can look it up.
No, it's
and
fine.
I didn't love anything that he wrote. He
Yeah.
was writing about a very different St. Louis than I grew up in.
Yeah.
And that was also part of it. I felt like there was, there was no story that was the story of what I experienced. And so I felt like, it's one of those things. If no one else is going to write it, then I have to be,
Sure.
if this is the book I want to read. As per Toni Morrison, I need to be the one to write it. And so that's sort of what started it. And then there's this record store that's in St. Louis. It's called Vintage Vinyl, and I never worked there. I was just a groupie. My brother worked there. My husband worked there. The guy I'm staying with down in Brooklyn, he worked there. And it was just this kind of really safe space. Mm-hmm. And I started thinking about what it would be like if that went away, because record stores were closing down all over the place. And I thought, okay, there's sort of a place to start the story from, of what if that really safe space in a city during a time where the city was grappling with how it felt about itself and it's what it meant to be safe to different people went away. What if it lost that? And so that was sort of where I, started from.
What was happening in St. Louis at the time, the 80s and 90s?
St. Louis is an incredibly segregated city. It's probably one of the most segregated cities
as Little Rock. Yeah.
In the United States. It has kind of historically been a place where, people have clashed around that segregation. And there's a street that runs through St. Louis from the downtown all the way out into the county that literally divides the city in half.
That's I-630 in Little Rock.
And this is called Delmar Boulevard, and
I know that boulevard.
They call it the Delmar Divide, and there's this little spot around Washington University that's called University City, and when I grew up there in the 80s and 90s, and probably started in like 60s and 70s, there was this real attempt to desegregate in a thoughtful and real way. Not just I'm going to put my kids on the bus and they're going to go to different schools, or like we're going to live together. We're going to live together. We're going to know each other. We're going to have our kids go to the same schools. We're going to build our synagogues and our churches and our everything right next to each other. And so that's kind of when I came into the city, was sort of in that era. It didn't last very long. White people started moving out, but not before there was kind of this group of people who had grown up together. And so that was really what I wanted to write about, was these friends that found each other because of where they lived, but also because of music and because of this record store and because of coming to, wanting to find a different space other than the space that they'd been segregated to for whatever reason. And so I felt really, and like I said, I was like, oh, this is just the way I figured that's just how young people were. I figured that's what teenagers did. That's just what I thought happened. And then that they came together and they found each other and all of the stuff sort of was there, but wasn't there so much that they couldn't be friends with each other. They couldn't spend time at each other's houses. They couldn't know each other's families. When I left St. Louis and came up here, I realized it was very different.
How so?
I found it much more, even though everybody lived in the same city, people didn't know each other. And I don't know if that was a big city thing versus a small town thing. New York's a pretty segregated city too.
Yeah, definitely.
And so to have to kind of get here and feel like, wait a second, why are all these people together and yet nobody like knows each other? So that was different for me.
Is that how it feels on Martha's Vineyard, or does it feel more like a community?
Martha's Vineyard is a really interesting place in that it is very, very different in the wintertime than it is in the summertime. So,
yeah, it's dead, right?
There are 15,000 people that live there year round, and there are 150,000 people there in the summertime.
Wow.
So it goes from this incredibly small, very rural, very kind of quiet small town of people who are very much working class, on or below the poverty line.
Wow.
To the richest people in the
Yeah,
in the
I was about to
country.
say that's all you really think of Martha's Vineyard.
Right. And it's really hard to deal with the preconceived notion. Like when my kid was applying for financial aid, they were making all these assumptions because of our zip code, and it's very, very different. It's wonderful.
Yeah.
It's an amazing community in that it's very rural and very, kind of nature centric, but it's also pretty liberal and left, which, as you know, coming from Arkansas, there's not a lot of rural communities that are also liberal, so there's enough of an exposure to politics and ideas and culture there that happens all year long. And it's not an incredibly racially diverse place in the wintertime, although it's more so than many places. But it's very much a community.
Yeah.
It's very much people who sort of bond around the other are the summer people that come in.
Yeah,
So if you're there all year, you're part of a group that is going to hold you all the time, regardless, of what you look like or your background, which is nice.
What brought you to Martha's Vineyard?
Growing up, my parents were professors, and so they had a house up there. And so every summer I would leave St. Louis, which was this kind of bizarre dichotomy to live through. Every summer we would leave St. Louis and go spend the whole summer on Martha's Vineyard. And in the 70s and 80s, kind of pre-Clinton, it was very much this kind of liberal art haven summertime thing. This very rich thing is the new Martha's Vineyard. So once I had kids, and once I was in Northeast, and then I was in Boston, and then I was a single parent, and I was like, you know what, I just need a place where I can actually let my kids run around outside. And so I moved to my mom's house and sort of figured out how to make it work in the wintertime because it wasn't really set up for that. And then we were hooked. Like once we were there for a year, we kind of started out for a year to see what it would be like. And then we were like, oh, we can't ever go anywhere else. This is it. It's this or, Europe.
This or Europe.
This or Europe.
Well, let's talk about the Nuepe Center because that's kind of how we got connected. We got connected through our mutual publicist, JKS Communication. Shout out.
Marissa, she's amazing. Yeah. Nuepe was started over 10 years ago by a poet, a man named Justin Aaron, who lives on Martha's Vineyard. And it was started in a bed and breakfast in Edgartown. And he really wanted to just create space for writers and community for writers. And it was wonderful. And he would bring writers in to do workshops, and he would have, had residencies, and it was in this beautiful old inn. And then he lost the inn. The woman who owned it had to sell it. And so he kind of said, all right, I'm going to put it all on hold for a while. And I was so bummed because it was one of those ways in which I could live on an island and yet have access to writers who weren't from the island. So there's a lot of great writers on the island, but after a little while, we've all heard each other read a lot.
Sure.
We're kind of like bored of each other's stuff. And, we've kind of learned what we can learn from each other. And writing is such a learning process, So I was just so sad to lose this place where other voices were coming in. And he started doing other stuff. And I have a great friend who is the director of the Featherstone Center for the Arts. And it's a beautiful kind of sprawling art center. And they just build all these new buildings, and it's, they've got everything. They've got pottery, they've got printmaking, photography. And I said, writing is art.
Yeah.
What if we bring these two things together? What if we reinvigorate Nuepe and have it happen here? at Featherstone. And so Justin and Anne and I got together and sort of hashed that out. And that's, you know, what he's doing a lot of writing and photography. And he was like, I want to be involved, but I don't want to run it anymore. And so I decided
That's where you came in.
That's where I came in.
Yeah.
And comes back to this whole idea of not having an MFA. You know, part of what I wanted to sort of build on what he had already done was to try to make a space for people who aren't able to go that route, right?
Yeah.
For whatever reason, whether they come to writing late in life, whether they can't afford that kind of, you know, to take that kind of time off. You know, I could never go do a 5-week residency. I have a job.
Yeah.
You know, I have kids. I have a family. So what kind of residency could I do? What would it what kind of thing could I offer to people, to writers, that would work for them in their real lives, you know? So we're working towards having, you know, weekend workshops and, you know, maybe long weekend residencies and, you know, sort of really bite size, can do in your real life, access to writing, and probably moving towards doing more stuff in the shoulder seasons. To again,
what's a shoulder season?
Shoulder season, sorry, is like spring and fall.
Okay.
So the big season on the vineyard is you know, July and August, and it's nearly impossible. It's expensive as hell. It's nearly impossible to get over. You know, all the boats are full, all the inns are full, all the restaurants are full, and it's just kind of annoying. You know, as a writer, what you want is space and quiet. You know, so but May, June, September, October, which are called the shoulder seasons, are beautiful and much more calm, and everything's still open, and so it's much more accessible. So we're really looking towards, and again, making it accessible, making it, if I'm trying to patch my life together with this job, and I'm writing and I'm doing this, I don't have enough money to come to Martha's Vineyard in July. You know, I can't pay that kind of room rate, you know. But I maybe could come up in October, you know, maybe I could get a long weekend, maybe I could do. So really thinking about what people who have lives that, you know, aren't funded some other way, you know, or have expenses and responsibilities that don't allow them to sort of have that kind of access to time and space that writers need. How can I create that for them?
Does the Nawepe Center, is it a residence? Do people stay on there, or no, they have to stay outside?
They have to, currently they have to stay outside. So we're sort of looking to, you know, working with different inns to see, you know, who's got some space maybe in the spring and the fall where we could kind of put some residencies together where people could come for 4 or 5 days and stay. You know, again, there's lots of amazing long residencies for people to do. And really, you know, it doesn't make sense necessarily to pay a lot of money to go somewhere just so you have a quiet room to be in. You know, if we can figure out a way that you can come have a quiet room to sit in a beautiful, inspiring place, you know, for not a lot of money.
This sounds like a dream.
Well, it's kind of like my dream. It's kind of like what I wished I had my first kid at 25, you know, so I was not, once I realized what was expected of me as a writer and what I was sort of supposed to have done, I was like, fuck, I can't do this, you know? And so how am I even supposed to figure this out? And so that was sort of where I kind of came to, and in this day, people have to have lots of jobs. Everybody needs many jobs. So how can you create that space and time for people that actually works in their lives?
Yeah. Well, I mean, speaking of your own writing and publishing and everything, when had you published anything before this book? Any stories or anything?
Yes. So I actually published a few stories that then went into this book. And I mean, like I said, I was teaching myself how to write. So I'd written like 4 novels.
But you also were a music journalist, right?
I was.
So did you go to school for that?
Nope. I got a straight English degree. My first job out of college was at a place that was called Princeton Publishing. And I was like, okay, you know, they needed an assistant to the publisher. I was like, okay, this sounds cool. Like, I'm into magazines. They published magazines. And I went in and on the wall there was like Cream magazine, which is one of the original, like, you know, music magazines. And there was a motorcycle magazine and a quilting magazine. I was like, okay, this is cool. And then I went in to talk to the woman who was the publisher, and I'm looking and I'm like, there's porn on the walls. Like, there's, and I found out that they also published Oui magazine, the OUI, you know, the French yes, and Blue Boy magazine, which is like the original like male gay porn magazine. And I went from, and I was like, okay, like I think I'm trying to, it was a good paying job. It was publishing. I was working as an assistant, and I was trying to write for Cream magazine as a music journalist, and wound up copy editing porn.
That's
like
awesome.
Making sure there were like no typos, that all the.
So when does that book come out?
That's one that I have been thinking. I mean, I think the first day I was there, you know, some guy had a heart attack in the office, and like, you know, it was every single person that worked there was either under 25 or over 60. And it was,
that is creepy.
it was such an interesting place to work. I wound up working there for like 2.5 years, and, you know,
I'm so jealous now. I'm like fascinated by the porn industry. Like, have you watched The Deuce or anything? Like,
I have.
watching,
Yep. And all of that is very, I mean, it became like a job, and, you know, I would sit with the art director, and we'd be looking at these pictures, and, you know, we're trying to figure out when we need to, you know, get that part out of there. That's
so you're the
gross,
person copy editing, like Sarah's a milkmaid in the middle of the
exactly.
woods.
That was my job. Like, I make sure that, like, and a lot of times these things would be written by, like, you know, quote unquote contributors, you know, be like dudes in their house in, you know, Long Island or whatever, and they would send in their story that they'd written, and it was riddled with, you know, inaccuracies and typos, and, you know, so it became what I had to do. I had to sit there and make sure that all the words were spelled right. Yeah, it was a great start.
I'm excited to read those stories when you write them, for sure.
And then somehow that segued into working at, I can't really remember how it worked, but I think because the publishing company also owned a printing press. That's what it was. They owned a printing press like out in Michigan or something, and Trace magazine, which is a British-based hip-hop sort of style and music magazine, wanted to move to start a United States issued version of Trace, and they were looking to use that printing press, and so I started writing for them, and that was really where I really started, you know, spent a lot of time doing my music journalism.
Yeah.
And that was really fun. Sadly, it was, you know, I sort of got into magazine writing right when the internet exploded. So magazines just started dropping. And so then a lot of my journalism was on websites that just are don't exist
Would
anymore.
we know any of them?
I don't think so. I think I'm trying to even remember the names of them. You know, there were these little things that would be like, this is the new startup of this new great, you know, and they would say, we're going to hire you, we're going to pay you this much money. And then 2 weeks later, they'd be like, actually, we just lost all our funding. We're not doing anything at all.
Yeah.
So at Trace, there was God, this is making me feel old that I can't remember the names of them.
That's okay.
Okay. They'll come to me tonight and 3 o'clock in the morning.
If you remember
I'll
at the
remember.
end. Yeah. Well, so when did you start working on There You Are?
Right after Michael Brown was murdered, I started. So that was the summer of 2014.
So right away.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It was really, you know, it was one of those things that the story had sort of been looking for a place to land. And that was really where it landed. And that's when it just sort of took off. And I started writing it.
Well, can you give us a little synopsis of the book? Tell us what's...
Sure. It's so funny the way it's been, you know, when you read all the ways it's
reviewed and stuff.
It's it was originally sort of positioned as a coming-of-age interracial love story that is set in a record store in St. Louis in the 80s and 90s. It has really four main characters that it sort of follows through the book. One is Mina, who is the daughter of a Jewish woman, single mother, really kind of fend for herself kid, who makes friends early on in the book with Octavian, who is Black, who's the son of a professor and a poet, and whose mom dies pretty early in the story. And Octavian has an older brother named Francis, who's super dynamic but really struggling with drug addiction. And throughout the book, Octavian and Mina sort of try to figure out their relationship with one another. There's Bones, who's the owner of the record store. And then there's Cyrus, who is Octavian's father. And those are really the four kind of key people. And then there's this kind of significant group of friends that spend time together at the record store and outside of the record store who, impact Mina and Octavian's relationship in different ways.
It's interesting that the shooting of Michael Brown impacted the story that you wanted to write, but it's set very pre-Michael Brown.
It is, except for that it kind of goes back and forth. So the Michael Brown piece is happening, and at the same time, Bones has decided he's going to close the record store. So he has invited he's going to throw a big party, and he's invited everyone back. And so Mina and Octavian, who have left and have left St. Louis and haven't really talked to each other since they split apart, are both navigating what it means to watch the kind of fallout from Michael Brown's murder, and then also thinking about what it would mean to go home and maybe see each other. So it sort of calls up all of these memories that they are both having about what it was like to grow up there. So even though the story is mostly set in the 80s and 90s, it does have this 2014 piece that everyone is sort of keeps coming back to.
So is there this reflection quality of looking at like what people were facing in the 80s and 90s versus 2014 and how maybe similar it still is?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep, absolutely. There's I think as someone who is from St. Louis, it was clear that nothing had changed. Nothing had changed. And the only thing that had changed is that people had cameras on their phones that they could now document what had been going on for forever, in St. Louis. And, my friends would come to my house and immediately get pulled over on their way home, just instantly. And that was just standard way things were done. And, that now people can just record it.
Yeah.
That's the only thing that's changed.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, it doesn't seem like it's changed. That even that part, you would think like, okay, now that you can record it, now that you can see it, things will change. Things will get better. But haven't gotten there yet either.
Well, are you up for reading?
I would love to. I was thinking about what I should read, and I think I should be something short. And someone recently commented on there's one part in the story that is told from the perspective of Francis, who is the older brother struggling with drug addiction. And this is sort of later in the book and isn't really anything about music, but it's a really kind of condensed piece, and I'm struggling to find it.
I am going to record you on Instagram, just a forewarning, because I know you said that you hated hearing your voice, which a podcast is probably the worst thing for you to be on. But you don't have to listen to
I don't have to listen to it. Well, and a reader wrote about how he felt like this was one of the best descriptions of what it was like to be addicted to, to struggle with addiction. And I thought, wow, I've never read this part aloud, and I love this part. And it was really hard to write. It was hard to write because it's hard to I love Francis so much, who's the older brother character, and it was really hard to get in his head and think about what it meant to struggle the way he does. Each of the chapters is named for a song. It has called this is track 15, and it's named for the song "Home Is Where the Hatred Is" by Gil Scott-Heron, which is a song about being a drug addict. All right. What no one understood, Francis thought, what no one ever understood was how much sobriety hurt. Not emotional, make you want to cry hurt, but actually hurt. Your bones, your muscles, your head. It hurt to take air in and out of your lungs. It hurt your heart to beat. Everyone else, they went on about their day, heart beating, lungs breathing, and they didn't even notice. But not me, Francis thought. I gotta feel every fucking thing. Walking hurt and eating and taking a shit. When he was using, he kept it at bay, made it so he never felt it fully. A shot of vodka could hold back the violent sound of the rush of blood through his veins. A hit off a joint could turn the firing synapses in his brain down to a low simmer. A line of coke, well, that could crank everything up so high, even pain felt good. And a shot in the vein, that was the ultimate quieting, the purity of silence. That's what heroin washed through him. It made the shivering, the watering eyes, the itch under the fingernails that he could never reach disappear. Sobriety shouted in his ears and woke him in the night to sheets soaked in sweat, t-shirt and boxer shorts drenched, salt in his mouth and eyes. At treatment, they told him to give it up to God, to count 12 steps, to amend and pray. But he worried that God would not be able to hear his prayers over the yelling in his head. Francis walked, he meditated, he made love, he was celibate. He bought gifts for his father, he listened to his brother's records and read his mother's poems. He walked some more, danced, ate only vegetables for days, tried to pray. Sometimes he would look up from his walking and find himself down on Goodfellow, right around the corner from an easy silence, and he'd turn quickly, nearly rushing into traffic, to put distance between himself and the relief that was so close at hand. And then sometimes, there would be moments when peace broke through the pain like gold bars of sunlight streaming through holes in the clouds. And then Francis wondered if somewhere on the other side of the noise and the pain, there might be a moment when he didn't feel like he was running for his life. And just the brief possibility of even a little less pain calmed him long enough to make it another day.
I'm going to ask a question, but
Yes.
you can tell me if this is too personal. And I say this full disclosure that I have addiction surrounding in my family. Listeners of our podcast know that Brian, our host, struggles with addiction. And do you have does addiction run in your family at all? Do you have experience with it?
I have not personally ever found myself addicted to anything other than nicotine, which somehow I was able to really pull myself away from when I had my first kid. But I have never not known addicts.
You've never not known addicts? Mm-hmm.
I have never. I've been in love with a lot of addicts. I've been friends with a lot of addicts. I've, navigated family members and siblings and close relatives and, all of the things that I've never not known them. They're very much a part of my world. So that was not based on a personal experience, but what I've witnessed,
right,
and what I've experienced and tried to understand from what I think it would feel like.
Mm-hmm. I asked this because I wanted to get to kind of what we were talking about before we came on the podcast, right? So I also am not, haven't, other than nicotine is also, I say, my addiction, but I write a lot about addiction as well because it's been in my whole life and stuff. But, we started talking before we got on the podcast about who has the right to write what, which I think is such a popular conversation.
Yep.
I don't know if you have any thoughts about what you wrote and did you have someone, it's very well written. And so in my opinion as a writer, every writer's I want to say that, fiction is open and you're allowed to write whatever you want as long as it does it justice. But I also understand there's delicate, historical conversations and layers to everything. So that's why I think it's just like interesting to have these conversations. And I don't know if you have any. So thinking about addiction as the topic.
Yep.
What are your thoughts on that?
I absolutely think that people are allowed to write. No one. I'm not here to tell anybody what they can and can't write. I think there, like you're saying, is room for lots of conversation around this. I don't know that people should just be able to write whatever they want. I don't know that that's true either. But I think that, I come back to, the questions. Alexander Chee has this series of 3 questions that he kind of referenced as what he now, when people ask him, well, how do I write about someone who doesn't look like me, right? And so he says, it doesn't give them advice anymore. He asks them 3 specific questions. And I think
do you know what those questions are?
I can look them up, and because I don't want to say them wrong. I can definitely find them because I've been thinking about this a lot. So there's an article in Vulture this October, and it's a great article. It's worth everybody reading. So the first question is, why do you want to write from this character's point of view? And the second is, do you read writers from this community currently? And the third is, why do you want to tell this story? And I think you can use those questions, why would I want to tell a story about an addict? Do I read writers who are addicts? Have I read their stories? And I think you can use those questions no matter what it is that you're sitting down to write, because as a really good starting place. I think as white people, we have a tendency to just assume that because we want to do something, we should be able to do it. I think that's how this country works for us. There's the narrative of you just got to put in your hard work and you're going to get whatever it is that you want, and so therefore you're allowed to have it. And I think that is very much a white narrative, a white, middle class, upper class narrative. And I think we have to be careful of that assumption that because we want to do something, therefore we can do it, and therefore we should do it. And I think there's a way in which we can absolutely contribute to important narratives, important stories without taking stories away from people. And I think it needs, if you've had addicts in your life and that's part of your experience,
right,
then that's not something that you are going to have to walk real far to get. You can, that's yours. That's your experience. That's your story. If I grew up navigating what it meant to be a white person in an interracial relationship, I can write about that. That's something I personally can write about. If we're going to take it all the way contemporary, I was not molested by a teacher, So if I wanted to write about that, I think I really would need to do some soul searching about why is that the topic I want to write about? That isn't something that happened to me. It isn't even something that happened to someone close to me that I know of, so it's nothing in my own experience.
You're referencing my dark Vanessa that we were talking about before.
So
yeah,
it's not like I don't think that's a really important topic. I think that's something that's really, it's just something we should be talking about, and we should be hearing those stories of those people, because I bet there's a lot of people out there that need to read that, that want to understand that experience, either because it's something they've also experienced or, for whatever reason, but it's not something I've experienced. So in order for me to write about that, I would have to do a massive amount of research. I would have to really, really, get into the archives of what that means. And
you'd also have to just be committed somewhat spiritually to it. I think a lot when these questions come up of the writer David Mitchell, he's one of my favorite authors of all time. And he writes with a heavy Japanese and Asian culture influence. I mean, he married a woman who's Japanese. He lives in Japan, and like Number 9 Dream, when it came out when he was like, I don't know, 28 or 30 or something like that, it was obviously like all Asian characters, and he's deeply rooted into the culture, but not because that's his culture. It's because he's like, that's the culture he fell in love with and has spent his entire life, and he's deeply invested, and the writing is just fire. I mean, it's just like there are not writers alive many who can write like David Mitchell. And so, I mean, like these conversations to me, it's very nuanced to have. Like, I like those questions because they help you get to that nuance. Whereas it's not helpful for someone like me to just say, fiction writing, you can write about whatever you want, because that gives license to a lot of people who are never going to think deeply about a culture or a subject or anything. And they are going to do it injustice. And that's how we get back to where we are today.
Right.
And like we were talking about American Dirt, what's her name? Cummins?
Janine Cummins.
Cummins.
Yep. And, I think to me, the activism that came out of that is the beautiful thing. The mobilization, the fact that, Miriam Gerba and David Boies, they were able to
I love Miriam Gerba. You read Mean?
I have read Mean.
So good.
And she's, the fact
I wrote a review on it a couple years ago anyway.
They were able to get people to pay enough attention and sit down with, the people at Macmillan and get them to agree to really look at their practices.
Yeah.
And, should it have come to that? No. They should have been, all this should have been happening anyway. If you're going to write, if this is what you're planning to make your money off of, think about what you're doing. But again, it comes back to that assumption of we want to do it, so we're going to do it. And I think they got caught out there.
Yeah.
And they should have.
And if you're not familiar with the controversy going around the book American Dirt or My Dark Vanessa slash Excavation, the memoir, I would highly suggest just looking it up and
or don't
or read the books and be a judge yourself.
Read.
From the excerpts that I've read from American Dirt, I'm just like, some of these are laughable stereotypes. How could anyone let that go forward? And we were talking about this before. To me, it seems that the publishing company almost wanted to put this, like Flatiron wanted to put it out there, because they almost, like, how you would not know that controversy would be immediately around this book is kind of baffling to me. So it feels almost like that, like, it's so icky that this is a publicity stunt on its own, because I bet it's sold books from
she's like, it's like still number one. I don't know enough about it, and I feel like there's a lot of people who know so much that it's one of those things that I'm not really necessarily in a place to speak on it when there are a lot of people that are speaking so well on it. So I would say, looking to those writers for some real clarification about what's happening. I think that, what I've been really kind of thinking about a lot and thinking about writing about is, as a white writer, Janine Cummins wanted to, from what she's saying, she wanted to tell us, she was concerned about immigration. She wanted to tell an important story. There are others who have lived through that, who've experienced that, who've already told that story. And so that's part of the problem. But I think, there is this struggle for white writers to figure out, well, what can I write about, right? What is it that I can write about that's going to contribute to changing things, And I think that white writers often think, well, okay, I'll write about a not white character, and then we get back to that same place. There's a lot that white folks can be writing about to address racism. White folks created racism, so they can write a lot about it, and really, like, we can really look at ourselves and really think about, what are we doing what characters can we create that we know really, really well because they're our mom or our coworker or ourselves, What are we doing? How are we impacting the world right now? There's 100,000 stories right there, without taking them away from someone else. I think that there is this idea that in order to write about racism and racial controversy and things like that we need to be writing about, people of color, when in reality, all you need to write about racism is white folks. But it means taking a hard look. It means really looking at ourselves. And I think, that's where the work is. And it can be done, and it won't take, you don't need a sensitivity reader. You don't need to go to a workshop to learn how to write about yourself,
Yeah.
But it means really looking at how you and the people around you do the things, how I look at myself. What do I do? When I was writing these white characters who were living alongside characters of color, I had to really think about, well, how would they really act in that moment? And how would they see how would they think about what they were doing? And what, from their perspective, what would they think they were doing? And then how would it be perceived, by someone else? So, the character Mina might think she's helping,
Right.
But really she's just trying to make herself feel better.
Right.
And that's the sort of stuff we as white people can get into and start putting on a page, and then people can read it and be like, oh, I do that. Shit. Maybe I shouldn't do that. Or maybe I should at least be more cognizant of that. All of a sudden people are like, I realize I say things like that. And I'm like, yeah, well, good. That's good. Now you say it. Before you didn't even know that you did it, and that's okay. And like, it's okay to be aware and understand, and that's really the first step.
Were there any really uncomfortable moments writing the book for you that like kind of gave you pause?
No, I really tried not to write about anything that I didn't feel totally like I had either experienced it or, had talked at length to someone who had experienced it or witnessed it happen. I decided that anything that felt like, maybe I shouldn't do this, maybe this is too uncomfortable, was my guide. And you're not putting that in there. And you're not going there. That's not your space to go into,
Okay.
Yeah, so that was really, were my sort of boundaries.
Is there anything that you learned from this book, even in like publishing it, or that really sticks out? What was that laugh for?
Well, my publishing situation was so the publishing I was bought by Amberjack. Amberjack Publishing, this wonderful woman named Dana was the publisher, and Cassandra was my editor. And then around June, they left the publishing house, and then was kind of not sure what was really going on there, and there was some shaky ground, and I wasn't really sure who was in charge, and then they brought other people in, and thank God there was another incredible editor named Sharita that was still there, and so she sort of got me through, and then it got sold to Chicago Review Press, and so it's just been a real, like, the fact that it actually exists in the world almost feels like a little bit of a miracle. And the JKS folks were incredible. So I learned a lot about how hard it is and how much work it takes to put something into the world like this. And I learned that I know a lot more about music than I thought I did.
Well, what's next? What are you working on now?
I'm working on a new
porn
novel.
industry
Not a porn
novel?
industry story. That's a good one. That's gotta happen. I am finishing up a work in progress right now that is really kind of thinks about what it means to love and care and be family to someone who is struggling really hard with mental health issues. And again, something that, I kept in my boundaries, feeling like this is something I know from my own experiences. I personally haven't had deep struggles with mental health, but many of those who I love and care for and call family have. And so that's, it's a story about a mother and a daughter. And what's kind of cool is that a lot of it takes place in Prospect Heights, Brooklyn. And I kind of didn't really think about it when I went to go stay with a friend in Park Slope. I was like, oh, I'm back in this neighborhood. I can walk around and sort of remember, these places and think about, and a lot of it is about how much the city changed, And so it was nice to sort of see like, oh, that shop's actually still there. And oh, no, that's definitely gone. So that game you play when you leave New York and you come back and you're like,
Yeah.
what's here that's wasn't here before. So yeah, that I'm excited about it, and it's sort of starting to get into be in decent shape. It's kind of it takes so long.
Well, where can people find you and information about the Noepe Center too?
So the best place to find all of that would be on my website, which is matheamore.com. Website was made by my incredible daughter, and she built it for me. She does things like that, which is cool. And there's links to stuff that's happening at Noepe there as well. And then if you go to the Featherstone Center for the Arts website, there is a link to all of the things that are happening at Noepe. Right now, we're just sort of doing what we're calling open writing hours and just opening up the space on Sunday afternoons. Whoever wants to come in needs a quiet space away from home, away from the laundry, to just sit.
That's
There's
great.
Wi-Fi, it's warm. And
I'll drive the 6 hours or whatever it is.
It's a really nice thing to just have on a Sunday, and it kind of takes that edge off of when am I going to write? When am I going to write? And you're like, okay, you're going to write tomorrow afternoon from 1 to 3, and that is, and so it's a little group that all kind of shows up with their computers or their notebooks and sits quietly and writes for a couple hours, and it's good.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, thanks so much for being on the show today, and congrats on the book and all the success.
So much. It's been a lot of fun.
Okay, that's it for today's episode. If you like what you heard, please subscribe and review on whichever platform you're listening. You can get in touch with us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Animal Riot Press, or through our website, animalriotpress.com. This has been the 49th episode of the Animal Riot Podcast with me, your host, Katie Rainey, and featuring Mathea Murray. Our transcripts for our deaf and hard of hearing animals are provided by Jonathan Kay. Our podcast assistant is Dylan Thomas, and we are produced by me, Katie Rainey. See you later, you filthy animals.
It's the burn, bombing on y'all and getting gully as the fern. I don't know much about